Be seated. Juries always prove to me we are creatures of habit. Although you don't have to sit in the same seats, you always do. But it's not just you. I mean, a lot of juries are the exact same way. Always amazing. Stay ready with this next witness.
Yes, Your Honor, but prior to that statement, I'd like to do a stipulation between the parties.
Proceed.
The parties do agree and stipulate that the defendant is the biological father of Sterling Koehn.
So stipulated, Mr. Garage? It is, Your Honor. Next witness.
The state calls Dr. Timothy Huntington.
Forward, sir. Raise your right hand. You promise the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth. So say I do.
I do.
Have a seat. Ms. Timmons.
Would you please state your name?
Dr. Timothy E. Huntington, Huntington.
Dr. Huntington, what do you do for a living?
I'm an associate professor of biology and criminal justice at Concordia University of Nebraska, and I'm a forensic entomology consultant.
Before we get into all that, why don't you tell us what your educational background is first?
Sure. I have a Bachelor of Science. I have a Master's of Science in entomology, specifically in forensic entomology from the University of Nebraska, and I have a PhD in entomology, again, specializing in forensic entomology from the University of Nebraska.
First of all, what is entomology?
Entomology is the study of insects and related arthropods. I usually tell people if you want to step on it, it's probably something we study in entomology.
How did you get interested in that field?
I needed to take a class when I was an undergraduate, and my advisor suggested it, and it was one of those things where I found the more I learned about it, the more interesting it got.
So what is forensic entomology?
So forensic entomology is the use of insects and related arthropods in association with legal cases. Typically we're talking about criminal cases such as this, although also would include civil cases such as lawsuits over insect infestations, things of that nature.
Just in general, what is it that bugs can tell us that's helpful to any type of legal case?
The vast majority of what I do is involved with insects determining time of death. So after a body has been deceased for a certain amount of time, it's very difficult to tell how long they've been dead. Insects are one of the few ways we can do that with real accuracy. Other cases would typically involve determining location of death, cause and manner and mechanism of death, and sometimes information about a suspect or something like that. Generally speaking, we're involved with cases of deceased individuals, although not always.
You said you're currently at Concordia University?
Yes, that's correct.
Where is that?
Concordia University is in Seward, Nebraska. It's about 25 miles west of Lincoln.
And what are your duties there?
So I'm an associate professor of biology and criminal justice. About 2/3 of my teaching load is in the biology program. About 1/3 is in the criminal justice program. I'm also the director of the criminal justice program.
This is a 4-year college.
Yes, sir.
Do you also do forensic consulting in the field of forensic entomology?
Yes, I do.
Tell us about that.
I'm a board-certified forensic entomologist, certified by the American Board of Forensic Entomology. I've been a consultant since approximately 2002. I've conducted investigations, looked at evidence in about 130 or so cases from 19 states and 4 countries.
You also have a contract with the Iowa Medical Examiners. It comes up that involves insects, they can just call you and you can come in and assist, correct?
That's generally how it works, yes ma'am.
Have you testified as an expert before
Yes.
in this particular field?
Yes, I have.
About how many times?
Probably 15 or 20 times.
And you had brought up something about 19 states, 4 different countries. Have you testified in all of those places?
No, I looked at my CV. I've testified in 6 different states.
Did you provide your curriculum details to the state prior to trial?
Yes, I did.
And
You may.
I'm handing you Exhibit 123. Is that your curriculum detail?
Yes, it is.
And will that provide a more specific, detailed background of your training, education, and experience?
All of the details are in there.
State Docker 123.
Any objection to 123? No objection. Is it?
Now, when you testify, do you always testify for one side or the other?
No, ma'am.
Have you testified for both the state criminal prosecutors as well as defense attorneys?
Yes. In fact, the majority of my testimony has been for the defense.
You actually testified in the Casey Anthony murder in Florida, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And that was for the defense?
Yes, ma'am.
How many forensic entomologists are there in the U.S. and Canada combined?
Right now, there are 17 that are board certified by the American Board of Forensic Entomology, which is the only certifying board in forensic entomology in the world.
And what did you have to do to get certified by this board?
So there's an application process that involves kind of letting them know what you've done and sending in example cases that you've worked on. There's a testing process, the written examination, a identification and kind of a laboratory examination process, and then a case study examination process. And the whole thing takes, I think, 11 and a half, 12 hours of testing. And then you're vetted by the current board members in that testing process.
And how long have you been board certified?
Since, that's a good question, 2006. So 12 years.
All right, so let's talk about insects a little bit. Do all insects have the same life cycle?
No. All insects have some sort of developmental process, depending on the type of insect, and by type I mean big groups, right? So if it's different if you're talking about dragonflies versus butterflies. So they have a different developmental process and the number of stages they go through, what those stages look like, and where you find them.
What about flies in particular? Are there several different kinds of flies?
Yes, there are many, many different kinds of flies.
In general, though, do they have the same type of life cycle?
It's the same type of life cycle, although there are a lot of differences within that. The flies go through a complete metamorphosis. So if you remember back to grade school when you learned about butterflies, flies do the same thing. They start out as eggs, the eggs hatch out into little larvae, caterpillars in the case of a butterfly, maggots in the case of a fly. And those grow and develop through a couple of different stages, and then they pupate, and then they emerge as adults.
What does pupate mean?
So pupate means to go from the in-between stage of a larva, which is a very different insect. So a caterpillar doesn't look like a butterfly. A maggot doesn't look like a fly. A bee larva doesn't look like a honeybee. And then there's an in-between stage called the pupal stage, where everything kind of becomes that adult body composition of the adult insect.
How does the life cycle fly help you in forensic entomology to come to any opinions about anything?
So the vast majority of the insects that a forensic entomologist like myself deals with are flies. And so knowing where they're at in their developmental process gives us a way of figuring out how old they are, what this is all about. Because by knowing how old an insect is and how we can associate it with where it's developing, then we can say, well, they've been here for this long, this is what this means. And that's kind of the general gist of it.
So if you come across a piece of evidence and all you see are flies and eggs, that tells you, well, they could only be here for a certain time because this is how long eggs are in that stage.
Correct. And the other part of the puzzle with this is the developmental stage, of course, and the species, because all the different insect species are different developmentally, and then temperature plays a major role in that as well.
And how does temperature play a role in that?
So insects are essentially cold-blooded. So the warmer it is, the faster they grow. The cooler it is, the slower they grow. And so we have to know something about the temperatures so we can accurately gauge how old the insects are. It's kind of like you can't just measure the height of, or the size of an insect and say, well, it's this many days old, because it depends entirely on temperature, how fast they're growing. So temperature plays a major role in calculations.
Is that why in the summertime we seem to have so many more flies and bugs and things like that?
That's one of the reasons.
And how was it that you became involved in the investigation of the death of Sterling Koehn?
I received a phone call from the Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office. I believe it was on the 1st of September. And they asked me if I would be willing to, or was available to look at some insect evidence from a case they were working on.
And what were you asked to do?
Anytime I'm asked to evaluate the insect evidence, that's typically the question they're asking. And originally I was asked to provide an estimate of the time of death.
Were you able to do that in this case?
Well, in this case, the insects aren't necessarily associated with the time of death the way they typically are with a case involving insect activity.
So this case was a little unique compared to what you would normally do with a dead body.
It was very different, yes ma'am.
And what was sent to you to evaluate?
I received 2 vials of insects, each containing a single insect, one preserved and one dead. That's an important step because the preserved insects are the developmental snapshot in time, so to speak, because that's what was present when they were collected. A live insect I request live insects to be provided because it makes it easier to identify them if I can grow them into an adult stage. As you can imagine, maggots are fairly difficult to identify. Many of them look pretty much the same, and so whereas the flies look very, very different. I also received a CD or a DVD that was photographs from autopsy.
And how are those things sent to you?
FedEx, overnight.
It sounds like it's important that, first of all, you need to identify which fly you're looking at, correct?
Yes, every species is different developmentally, and so that's kind of a first step in evaluating. We really need 3 pieces of evidence to make a determination using insect activity. And the stage, again, is that kind of where they're at in their growth cycle. The second thing is, of course, temperatures, and the third is their developmental rates for that species. And then those 3 things together will provide enough information to make an estimate.
Was the evidence that you were provided sufficient for you to do an evaluation of this case, or did you ask for anything else?
In this case, information was provided on temperatures from the scene and the location of the remains, so that was pretty good. The insects that were provided were not as complete of a sample as I would have liked to have seen. There were some specimens missing that should have been collected, but those were present in the photographs, and so the photographs provided enough details.
So walk us through the process of what you do when you're formulating an opinion about this. What are you doing with the evidence?
Okay, so the first thing that I do when I receive a live sample is I try to rear it out to adulthood because, like I said, that makes life easier for identification purposes. And to do that, I was able to move. In this case, it was in the pupal stage, so it wasn't feeding. I didn't have to make sure that it had food or anything. I was able to move that into a separate container and then basically keep an eye on it to watch for adult emergence. The preserved sample I identify underneath the microscope using those physical characteristics. Every insect has external characteristics that make it unique, even though they all look pretty much the same. So I do that with a microscope and using published identification keys to identify the species and stage of development. After that, I'm using the temperature information that was collected and the developmental rates for the species that was identified to calculate how old the insect is based on a principle called the accumulated degree day principle.
So let's
Everyone,
talk.
you're okay?
I'm sorry, I have a cold, so.
Why should
Let's
there?
Let's talk about what type of insect that you found in Sterling's body.
So the species was identified as a fly commonly called the scuttle fly. The fancy scientific name for it is Megacelia scalaris, but I'm just going to call it the scuttle fly since it's hard to spell. That's a small, kind of brownish fly, frequently seen around garbage cans or dead animals, and you've maybe seen it in your kitchen. A lot of people think they're fruit flies, but they're actually scuttle flies.
And you know that it was a scuttle fly based on your observations of the evidence that was sent to you?
Yes, the morphological characteristics, the physical characteristics on the outside of the maggot and the pupal case are very distinct. In this case, the live sample did not emerge as an adult, which is not terribly uncommon. They typically don't like being shipped via FedEx for some reason. And so I didn't have the confirmation of the adult's fly, but that's okay. This species is really easy to identify. Common flies, they're what we refer to as cosmopolitan flies, meaning you can pretty much go anywhere on the planet Earth and find them, particularly in urban areas because they like being around people, because we make a lot of food for them. So that's interesting that this common fly is there, but also this is a fly that is more attracted to waste material like garbage or feces or things of that nature, not so much decomposing tissue like a dead body. So initially seeing this insect, it was very clear that this is not the type of case that I normally deal with where I'm using the insects that are there to eat the body. This is a separate kind of a case, and the medical term for it is myiasis.
What is myiasis?
So myiasis is maggots feeding on either the body itself or fluids coming from the body. There's lots of different types of myiasis, lots of different types of flies that can cause it. Typically, people think about it as a wound myiasis, where you have a festering necrotic wound that is infected, a lot of dead tissue, and then the maggots get in there into that wound. That type of myiasis is called traumatic or wound myiasis, and that's not what this was. This type is referred to as a facultative myiasis, where the insects are feeding on body fluids, in this case feces and other potential fluids coming from wounds, which is more commonly, or rather, it's not really what we see usually when we see maggots on live humans, but it does happen.
So at this point, was there a shift in how you were going to start looking at things?
The shift is really in the what it means phase of it. The process is really the same as far as figuring out how old they are, but rather than correlating the initial presence of insect activity to a time of death, now it shifts from that to a period of infestation and what's attracting those insects to the body to infest it while it's still alive.
All right, so what did this particular fly tell you about the seed or
You don't find these flies in laying eggs and growing and developing in sanitary conditions. You can get this fly if you have that festering infection wound. It does happen. It's not very common, but it does happen. But this fly would not have been there without the presence of feces and urine and potentially the other body fluids there.
Are you able to say, well, how quickly does the scuttlefly attract to feces or urine?
If you provide, so what attracts the insects is they're looking for a place to lay eggs. And so, yes, the adults will feed as well, but they're really more interested in the next generation because that's the whole point of biology, right? And so the maggots need some food and need something to eat, so there has to be a food source for the females to come in and lay eggs. So once that food source is there, in most circumstances it's going to be very competitive and the flies are going to try to get there as quickly as possible. Now, that being said, most people don't have a large population of these flies living in and around their homes. So there's going to be an initial attraction to get there very quickly, but how fast the insects can actually access that food source for their maggots is kind of the potential difference, especially in this case.
In this particular case, did you have an estimated period of infestation?
Yes, so the maggots were developing at that scene, at that location, for between 9 and 13 days. That's how old those insects were. That's not including how long it's going to take for them to start laying eggs, though.
Would that put about August 20th then as the latest date that the first infestation would have occurred?
So the initial infestation would be around August 20th, August 21st.
Do you have an opinion in this case as to whether during this period of infestation, the first time flies attracted there and those eggs, had started to leave days or had any of this bedding changed?
So there's two components to this. One is that the maggots, while feeding on their location, are relatively easy to identify, easy to disturb. So if I'd say a diaper had been changed, those maggots would go with the diaper. They wouldn't remain on the body. Also, once the maggots are done feeding, they crawl away from the food source to go through that pupal stage. And so in this particular case, we see maggots not only crawling away from the remains, but also the puparia, the pupal cases in the bedding and the clothing around the child. And so had either of those things taken place, they wouldn't have been there. They would have been absent from that location.
And do you hold those opinions to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let's go back and start with the period of infestation. You said that once the attraction is there, what is the initial attraction?
So in this case, it's going to be one or a combination of things, either feces, urine, and or body fluid discharge from open wounds.
How does a fly know that that's there?
So flies are very good at detecting smells. If you look at the antennae of a fly, that's what they're for. They're for smelling. And the flies that I typically deal with, the blowflies, can smell a food source about 2 miles away. That's how sensitive they are. Scuttle flies, we don't quite have that much information about their level of attractiveness, but it's going to be much better than you and I can smell, probably even better than dogs can smell. And we know that that's very powerful. So they detect that chemical cue very readily, and then they go to that food source as rapidly as possible to avoid competing with others.
How are they getting, if it's in an enclosed building, how are they getting to that food source?
So scuttleflies are very, very small, and so open opportunity to get inside, but they could fit underneath the cracks of doors, any kind of open windows, or even holes in the screening around a window. Those flies are going to get access. It's very, very difficult to keep flies away from a food source.
They're very determined.
They're very determined.
So how long would a child need to be in a dirty diaper before that attraction starts?
Well, as a parent, we all know that you can smell a dirty diaper. So that initial attraction is going to be there, but getting access to the diaper is going to take some effort. Obviously, diapers are designed to keep things in, and so the more barriers you put up, the more difficult it is going to be for insects to gain access to it. So a diaper, for example, being very tight against the skin is going to be a much bigger challenge than if you just had a pile of feces, laying in your backyard from your dog. Additionally, clothing, blankets, any of that material is going to be a barrier that's going to slow the insects down.
Do you have an opinion in this case as to how long it may have taken for that attraction to happen and for them to get to the source?
So in this case, about a day is probably the minimum it would take for the insects to actually gain access to the point that they can lay eggs. Because again, indoors, making it through them behind closed doors, getting access to that scene, there's blankets and clothing and the diaper proper. All of that is going to provide a barrier to delay the insects from getting there. So approximately a day.
Now, once the flies were able to get whatever food source we're talking about, they still have to be able to have access to feed, correct?
Correct.
What are the barriers, putting aside the walls and blankets and things like that? Are there other barriers that flies have to be able to sit down and eat?
So, as you know, when you're at a picnic or something and you're eating and you have the flies buzzing around your plate of food, you kind of shoo them away. And flies are very attuned to that, which is their nervous system works much faster than ours does. And so while you're trying your hardest to swat that fly, it looks like to the fly that you're moving in slow motion. So that's why it's difficult to swat flies. Flies are very sensitive to movement so that to protect themselves. And so any kind of movement will generally shoo the flies away. So if you have a house fly land on your arm, for example, and you move, generally speaking, they fly away. So any kind of movement of the child would deter flies from trying to lay eggs at that point as well. It tells me that very likely he was not in a state of normal mobility. Thinking about, kicking legs, for example, in a child, that would shoo flies away. Waving of arms would shoo flies away. And so it is extremely likely that he was not very mobile at that point.
And other humans moving around the child could shoot flies away.
Absolutely.
So So once the flies had access to the food source, the sterling, what happened?
So once the flies make their way to the food source, the female flies are going to taste it with their feet, essentially, which is, again, why flies walk around on your food before they start eating it. They're going to check out the site, make sure that it is a suitable food source for their babies. They're probably going to eat some, and then they'll start depositing the eggs. Female flies can lay a number of eggs, 50 to 100 or so in this case. And that's kind of the initial start of where that development starts with the immature maggots, or the immature flies.
How long is that process?
It depends fairly quickly, depending on the circumstances, anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours, once they've gained access.
In this particular case, are you able to say the time frame of when the eggs were laid?
Yes, so looking at the temperature of the scene and the developmental stages of the insects themselves, the eggs would have been laid between 9 and 13 days prior to the discovery.
After the eggs are laid, then what happens?
After the eggs are laid, the eggs hatch out into maggots. The maggots begin as very, very small, what we would call first stage maggots. And the maggots will begin to feed. In this case, they're going to be feeding on, again, all or a combination of either feces, the urine-soaked material, and body fluid discharge. As they're feeding, they tend to congregate into larger masses, although depending on the number of flies that gain access and lay eggs, it could be several masses. As they feed, they're going to get to a developmental stage where they need to shed their exoskeleton and grow, and then they become a second stage maggot. They continue to feed. They develop to the stage of a third stage maggot. They continue to feed, and then eventually they're going to crawl away and find a place to pupate.
How long does this 3 stages of maggot phases take?
It depends on temperature.
So let's talk about temperature. How did you determine what factor temperature played in the development at this scene?
So the recorded scene temperature was 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and so that is the temperature that I used for the insect development in this case. Keeping in mind that about half of the insect's development takes place at what is essentially room temperature in cases of myiasis. But just to make sure that I like to be conservative in my estimates. I don't like to narrow things down too much or make mistakes. I actually, with the help of a colleague, performed an experiment where I recorded the temperature inside of a dirty diaper first thing in the morning, every morning when they woke up, to record what that temperature was. And the reason I did that is because temperature makes such a big difference. I wanted to make sure that I accounted for variables. And that temperature turned out to be 91.5 degrees Fahrenheit on average. And then taking that calculation into account makes about a 1-day difference, meaning that it speeds up the development by about 1 day. But again, given the time that the insects are going to spend off of the feeding site proper as they develop, it's not a very significant difference, and I believe the 85 is probably the more accurate temperature to use in this case.
And where do you know, is this from scientific studies, that you know if it's 85 degrees, this is how quickly they're going to hatch?
Yes, so a number of studies have been done. The studies that I used in this case was published in the Journal of Medical Entomology in 1991. I've conducted similar studies myself for other species. The way you determine this is we rear insects at different temperatures and figure out how long it takes for them to go through these developmental stages. Once we do that, we can plot their development on a line, and it's a predictive linear progress. We do the same thing when we look at insects that affect crops and fields for when we spray. Growing time and all of this is a common agricultural practice as well. So that this is a well-established science.
So in this particular case, how long?
Say that again.
In this particular case, how long was that?
Honestly, I didn't calculate it specifically for the maggots because they were not the oldest life stage. So at the time that the body was recovered, there were very young maggots and very old maggots. Because they're not the oldest stage of insect associated with the remains, their development time is less important. So,
After the maggots have gone through their phases, is that, you said they crawl away then?
correct.
Where, from this particular scene, where did you see that at?
So the insects were pupating in the bedding area around the child, in the clothing as well.
What happens once they pupate?
Once the flies pupate, their exoskeleton hardens, and inside of that, they turn into an adult fly. You can tell the age of a pupal case by looking at the color. So they start out a cream color, very maggot color, for lack of a better term, and then they darken with age. So you can tell by looking at a puparium if it is a relatively recent stage transition or if it's been there for quite a while.
And why do they crawl, when they're pupating, why do they crawl away from the food source?
The predominant theory is that if you're a maggot that is stuck eating somewhere and you don't leave that site, then predators know that you move around quite a bit, but the pupal cases don't. They're completely sessile. They don't move at all, and so they crawl away essentially to hide.
And is it this final stage then that you're able to give a time frame for how long?
Yes, that is correct.
You've been in that chair like that?
Yes,
And that's the 9 to 13 days.
correct.
Now, first responders testified that they observed those scuttle flies, or they would say gnats or fruit flies, flying around his head. When they picked up the blanket, they saw several come out. What does that mean to you?
It means one of two possibilities. Scuttle flies are flies that will continue to lay eggs on a source as long as it is possible for them to successfully complete development as maggots. And so they will continue to colonize that food source for a very long time, much longer than most flies will. So that's one possibility, that they were just there attracted to the remains. The other possibility is that they could have been flies of what would essentially have been the first generation that completed development and were then flying away from the remains, having completed that pupal stage and emerged as adults.
If Sterling had been awake or coherent during any of this, could he have felt that, the flies or the maggots crawling on?
Almost certainly.
Have you ever had that? Have you ever had maggots crawling on you before?
Yes, many, many times.
And that was by choice?
By choice, yes.
What did that feel like?
It's a crawling sensation. If you've ever held earthworms, they have little spines in their bodies that they use for gripping. So you can certainly feel them crawling and moving.
Sterling also had a pretty bad infection from a diaper rash where his skin was raw and exposed. Could the maggots have been feeding on that as well, if there was any oozing or anything coming from that?
Yes, absolutely.
In this particular case, how important is the location of the maggots to you?
The location of the maggots is very telling because when I was originally sent this case, they were the medical examiner's office was asking about time of death. Maggots in a body where they're attracted after the individual has already died lay eggs in very specific locations. Generally, the eyes, nose, and mouth are going to be the first locations that they lay eggs in for a variety of different reasons that I don't need to bore you with. And so the fact that none of the maggots, flies, or eggs were associated with those locations and were found in and around the diaper area indicates again this is not a postmortem infestation.
It's myiasis.
It is myiasis, or maggots infestation while it's still alive.
And just to be clear, this 9 to 13 days, that's from eggs being laid to the pupation, right?
To where they're at in their pupal stage, yes, ma'am.
And you testified earlier that there's probably at least a day for the fly to get to the food source in the first place.
Yes, ma'am.
And that could mean a day of the fly around the child just trying to get into the diaper or whatever it may be, correct?
Absolutely.
So really we're looking at a total of 9 to 14 days.
I would say 10 to 14 days.
Could I ask you to pick out a few photographs that would help illustrate your testimony?
Yes, ma'am.
And where did those photographs come from?
Those photographs came from the medical examiner's office taken at autopsy.
Why were these photographs important to you?
Because I did not attend the autopsy, I use photographic evidence to get the complete story. It's very important that I know the context of all of the evidence that was recovered, and then also to look for evidence that was not recovered. In this particular case, the samples I received did not include the oldest insects that were present. The oldest insects are obviously going to be the most important indications of the duration. And so I use the photographs to gain that information for myself.
I have photographs that were entered through Dr. Klein. They are photographs 119, 120, 114, and 122. And are those the photographs that you asked me to pull up today?
Yes, ma'am.
Just so the jury knows what's going to be on is the first photograph, 119. That's somewhat of a close-up of Sterling at the medical examiner's office, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And the rest of those are similar to that, correct?
Correct.
All right, we have Exhibit 119 on the screen. And go ahead and stand up if you need to, but if you can stand on the far side so the court reporter can see, that'd be great.
However, if any of the jurors can't see, because she's standing on the other side.
Stand on the other side.
But if you can't see the picture because of where he's at, let us know, okay?
What was it about this photograph that was relevant to your opinion?
This photograph shows a couple of important points of information. One is here in this location, this location, this location, we can see maggots that are moving away from the food source. So these are maggots that have finished feeding and are looking for a place to pupate, which is, again, that kind of last stage of maggot development.
And just so we can make the record clear, you pointed to 3 different spots. Can you give a more descriptive area as to where those spots are at?
Certainly. So the first location is on the right leg, on the pants, the camouflage pants.
And it looks like just a white dot.
It's a white dot unless you know that you're looking at a maggot. It zoomed in, it's very obviously a maggot. Two of the maggots are present on what would be the seat belt portion in the left side of the seat belt for the swing.
And these are the maggots that you said would have crawled away during that process?
Yes, and you know they're crawling away. We know that they're in that last developmental stage for a couple of reasons. One is that there's no food where they're at, so they don't leave their food source unless they absolutely have to until they're ready to leave. And then also their size and physical characteristics are consistent with that as well.
Go back.
Also in this picture, there are a few of the fly puparia as well. Again, a little less obvious. Clothing, I'm not sure what it is, the blue fabric there by his right knee. There are a couple of fly puparia. So these are those maggots that have already crawled away and are actually pupae at this point.
Exhibit 120, what is it in this picture that's relevant?
In this photograph, it will be a little bit hard to see without magnifying it, but there are quite a few maggots that are on the bottom edge of the right pant leg area of his right leg. Several maggots that are in the feeding stage, as well as one that is crawling away. And then also on the right hip, there's a group of maggots that's crawling away from the food source.
How do you know the ones are in the feeding stage?
Under magnification, you can see that there's a cluster of probably maggots. Maggots have an interesting body type. Their respiratory organs, the parts they breathe out of, are in the posterior end. So they feed in a head-down fashion, so they can keep their heads kind of buried in whatever they're eating and still able to breathe. And so under magnification, you can see this group, their head portion is down into the food source, and they're feeding in a group, which is very characteristic.
Exhibit 114, what do we see here?
So in this case, again, there are maggots in the feces that's located in the diaper. Also, there are maggots on the base and shaft of the penis. These maggots are actually quite a bit smaller, which means that these are not those very old maggots, but that the flies are continually laying eggs during the infestation period. So some of these maggots are probably only going to be a day or two old versus the rest of them that are a week or more old.
Exhibit 122, what is that?
This is a close-up image of the bedding material that was in the swing. And this one shows a group of about 6 or 7 fly puparia that have pupated in the swing seat away from the food source. And this one shows several that are much more advanced than the ones that I was sent originally. So here you can see these two puparia are very lightly colored. And that means that they've recently pupated. These three are a more of a tan brown color, which means they're a little bit older than those newly pupated. This one, a few hours, and that one may have popped out as an adult. So it's a very end of development for that insect, which means it's been there almost that full time.
So the bottom line is you were able to see the entire life cycle of that fly on Sterling or in his diaper or on his clothes, wherever it may be.
Correct.
case ended up being, for you, more about myiasis, feeding on something that's alive, but were you able to come in at conclusions about time of death or anything like that?
In my opinion, if the child had been dead more than a day, we would have certainly seen other insects colonizing the body. There's no reason that they weren't there, and especially knowing that those scuttle flies were present, they would have been colonizing other parts of the body, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, along with other flies like blowflies and flesh flies, the flies that I'm more used to seeing on decomposing remains.
The scuttle flies themselves that were there would have moved to a different spot.
I don't see why they wouldn't have. Everything was available with easier access.
I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Cross.
Thank you, Dr. Huntington. The warmer the temperature, the more quickly the flies develop. Is that correct?
In general, yes, that's correct.
Where did you get the 85 degrees that you used as the temperature?
On the information for this, they noted that an officer or someone at the scene recorded the temperature in the room where he was discovered at 85 degrees.
And if the temperature where Sterling was or where the flies were lower, that would slow down the development, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And for purposes of your comparison, your report indicates that you checked the stool of a healthy 4-month-old baby, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So by healthy, I assume that child did not have a fever,
And not that I'm aware of.
was not suffering from sepsis.
No.
You also talked about, made the example of when we're at a picnic and flies land on our food, we sweep our arm, flies away. Once we're done moving, or once the movement is done, the flies off and return.
Yes.
So if humans were moving around Sterling, if those humans left, it's possible flies could come back, correct?
Well, the consideration is really twofold. One, the movement of humans around Sterling, and then also Sterling's movement himself.
And you talked about scuttle flies being very small flies. They're able to crawl underneath doors, getting through, I think you even said screen holes. Is that accurate?
Well, holes around window screen, so a hole in the window screen.
Are they small, like what the layperson would think of as a gnat?
Very similar.
Once the eggs are laid by the fly, how durable are the eggs?
You're going to have to explain what you mean. Okay.
Assume that the scuttle fly lays eggs in fabric. If that fabric itself is moved, if it's wadded-up fabric, and I just move the wadded fabric as it is into another room, does that destroy the eggs?
In general, it shouldn't, with the caveat, of course, that there has to be a reason for them to lay eggs on the fabric.
Correct. And just to make sure that I understood, you heard your testimony, you said in general it should not, correct? Should not destroy the eggs.
Yeah, it should not, because certainly there are instances if you happen to grab the eggs, for example, it will crush them.
Thank you, Doctor. I don't have any other questions.
Will redirect.
No.
Mr. Speech. Further witnesses from the state.
May we approach over?
Step back here. Step right from it.
Sure.
All right, with the caveat that the state has made an offer of court exhibits that will not go to the jury outside the scope of the jury, why did you do witnesses for the state?
No, Your Honor, the state rests.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we're going to take a recess. I don't know for how long, just to let the defendants get organized with the presentation of their case and their witnesses. They do have witnesses available. It's just to get everybody assembled and get rolling with their side of the case. So, we'll come get you when you're ready.
All right.